Let's come to Vision 10, and we're looking towards every presentation bridging the one before with the one that follows it, so that any given presentation is not just phenomenal, but is linking. And the links are by resonance, not by connections. So that the entire phase is a set of resonances that can be not only tuned to a calibration, but can be recalibrated into new tunings. So that our learning, our form of learning, is as superior to the old instruction as calculus was to the old arithmetic. If you learn by categories in an instructional mode, you can expect to retain in memory, in rote memory, only so much of it, and as time goes by, it becomes less and less. After a period of 5 years, not to mention 10 years, you can remember such little bit of what you were instructionally given in a categorical subject that you would not pass an initial test. And this is true of all of education on this level. Unless you maintain, you're going to forget. And if you maintain, what usually happens is that you refine it and it gains in complexity, and so you become an expert on less and less and forget more and more of the context. And so one tends to become, in this mode, an idiot savant. You're extremely expert on the few things that you really know, and you have forgotten a great deal of what you once knew, and you were never shown most of what one could know. And this begins to have an effect psychologically, and eventually has an effect sociologically as well, to make it necessary for you to have artificial connections to bridge the gaps. And so political society is largely an artificial construct of trying to furnish a plan of those connections. And we say then that this is the political party platform. This is our doctrines. This is our constitution. These are the laws, and so forth. It is a losing proposition because it dries up especially the inner resources of the person. One of the first casualties is that one leans on ritual figurations and on emotional configurations and upon very limited mental associations. Our learning obviates all of those flaws, all of those faults permanently. It is a maturation process, and the more you practice this, the more it will work for you. In effect, you are learning how to learn by having a double focus. One is the natural focus that integrals are made in a concentric focusing, and that differentials are generated in larger and larger arrays, so that the integral and the differential modes are in a complementarity. And by learning how to be with both over a set period of time, over a 2-year period of time, you will have acquainted yourself twice over with the entire range of what you are capable of addressing. it used to in antiquity sometimes be called like the Lighthouse Beacon, which shines very narrowly, but because it rotates in a full circle, the light of that narrow beam describes the entire circle, the entire amphitheater of what is there. The lamp of the mind, though it is limited naturally by its frame of reference, if that frame of reference is mobile, one can do a panoramic cam shot of the entirety and give you the complete context at not sacrificing the ability to focus within a frame of reference. So our learning here is rather sophisticated, and we'll talk more next week about how in modern mathematics and complexity theory, modern science, this is right on the cutting edge. It introduces us to the fact that there is a hidden scalar in reality. And one of the ways in which to talk about is through fractal theory. And a living fractal form is something like the broccoli plant, where the most minute fraction of the head of broccoli replays itself throughout the entirety until you have the entire head. It has the very same form, so that one could have a scalar that goes from the smallest unit to the largest entirety and never have to lose your understanding of its formal structure and of the scalar that happens. With us, we're trying to appreciate how a primordial binary of 0 and 1 come into play together and generate through their interplay the development of all of the forms and processes which are constituting ourselves and everything that is real. It isn't that everything is reduced to a binary code, but there is an encoding mysteriously because of the nature of 0. 0 does not encode simply as 0, but encodes logically as infinity as well. And so while natural integrals can be characterized to almost any degree of specificity by zeros and ones, computers work like this. Supercomputers work very refinedly like this. But consciousness is a differential ecology and is not characterized by zeros and ones, but by zeros and infinities, so that one has a different orientation. One looks not to understand by bringing something together, but to appreciate by letting the full spectrum be available in 2 successive waves. The first wave is a wave of appreciation, of a critical appreciation, that one can appreciate that there are many ways to do something. There are many possibilities of understanding different facets and different angles. All of them will not be equal, but a great many of them can be brought together in a play of a gestalt which is superior to a single phenomenal reduction. And so art forms are always an appreciation of the arrays of possibility in a formal structure, and art forms are therefore prismatic. Whereas ritual forms in existence in the integral nature of things are pragmatic. So ritual forms always are based on the pragmatos, the action. And if one understands pragmatically what you are doing, what is going on, one can not only follow the action, but characterize it to almost any degree of specificity that you want. These are the steps This is exactly how one does each of these steps in exactly this intervaling, and one can then reproduce accurately in a ritual comportment exactly what you did before. And it gives us that kind of integral certainty that is pragmatic. But differential forms, art forms, are prismatic. They may record different possibility gestalts at different times for different people, so that the critical appreciation is not one of pragmatic orientation, but of prismatic exploring. It's a very deep appreciation for us that the human person is a prismatic form, whereas the existential figure of ourselves is a pragmatic form. So that we have two different ways. And those two different ways, those two different modes, have their development. The pragmatic base of action defining existence specifically allows for symbolic forms in the mind to be exactly accurate integrally. It isn't that ideas are difficult to make clear. One can have very clear ideas. Even clearer ideas, because the pragmatic base of symbolic thought is a higher order of integral than existential action, so that minds symbolically can be accurate to an nth degree of specificity. They can even find their accuracy coming down to understanding one, unity, oneness, and also to understanding that if unity, if oneness is absent, that which now occurs is purely zero. And the appreciation of pure zeroness in the mind and of pure oneness in the mind was always the ancient wisdom pair that went together. But in order to appreciate the zeroness in the mind, one must be willing to have a preparatory acceptance. And that is by coming to realize complete emptiness in the mind does not in any way erase you as an existential figure. Nor does it obviate then your symbolic individuality. What gets in the way of this is that it is initially not believable, because one is certain that if you had a complete zeroness in your mind, it would be an oblivion from which you would never recover. And so the natural movement of integration is not to recognize zero at all in the mind. And that the prefatory step of recognizing zero is recognizing one in the mind, oneness. And so one prepares not to be exposed to potential oblivion by also not allowing oneself to come to the refinement of having a pure unity in the mind as well. The Sanskrit term for one-pointedness in mind was ekagrata. It means holding only one in the mind. If one can do that, it is a very simple exercise to take the acceptance of oneness and allow it to mature in its natural complementarity to the absorption of zeroness. It is a very, very famous occurrence, not only in Eastern yoga, and in Western prayer, but in many different kinds of meditations that have been made through the interpenetration of East and West for thousands of years. Our education, our learning, consistently on every level allows for the zeros and ones to have their interplay, and for the zeros and infinities to also have their interplay differentially. Right now we're talking about vision, and we're looking at the way in which a visionary process is conscious in a very, very special differential way. That while nature as a process is integral, and experience, the mythic horizon of experience, is integral, visionary consciousness is differential and works in a completely different mode. It is like another dimension. It is like a fifth dimension. And whenever it is brought into play, you bring a fifth business into play, as they say in the theater. You get magic. You get the magic that something can now transform and become different from what it was, though it certainly bears some relationship to it, but it's not a connected relationship. It's not an integral relationship. It is a magical transform. We're taking Shakespeare and Shelley. We're taking Shakespeare's last great play, The Tempest, which is about a magician named Prospero. And we're taking Shelley's last great major work, Prometheus Unbound. Prometheus, who is chained to one of the highest mountain peaks in the Caucasus Mountains by Zeus, because Prometheus knows a big secret about Zeus, that he is destined to be replaced in his cosmic power, and that the replacement is man. And Prometheus is chained there so that he can never tell anyone this. He is permanently exiled forever. That binding of Prometheus was the key to the final dramatic, tragic, Greek tragic trilogy that was written by Aeschylus, the founder of Greek tragedy. He wrote it about 456 BC, just before he died. He lived to be almost 90 years old. But the two plays that followed Prometheus Bound were conveniently lost in antiquity, so that they were not able to be read. 2,300 years later, Percy Shelley completed and wrote Prometheus Unbound. He skipped over to the third play in the trilogy. And one of the reasons is that the second play in the trilogy could be called Shakespeare's Tempest. It's a very interesting thing. In fact, the relationship of Shelley in his time, in his capacity as a poet, a visionary conscious poet, is linked with Shakespeare, because in his time, he became the greatest visionary poet, probably of all time. And one of the reasons is that there was a young man who was an extraordinary poetic genius. Had he have not died at age 31, he would have gone on to become even more famous than he is. His name was Sir Philip Sidney. And Sir Philip Sidney and Shelley both wrote famous defenses of poetry to show why poetry was an art form, and that one of the reasons that art forms are not allowed in closed societies is that art forms are like an antidote to the dependence upon political forms, upon indoctrinated psyches, upon planned sociologies, and that if it were known by a broad swath of the population that they could be free on many levels individually, socially, and not just free for a politics of freedom, but freed from politics itself as a confining form and released to art forms and released to spiritual person prismatics rather than the guided kinematics of laws and rules. So that art is definitely, almost by structure, an antagonist to existing power structures. And that this has always set up a very deep animosity, almost like a projection of the fearfulness to find zero in oneself, or even the prelude of finding oneness in oneself. The sociological thing about art is that it would show how by critical appreciation one eventually refines not only to see the zero and the one, but the infinity of the universe. Not the universe so much. The universe, as we talked last week, it means one place. It is an integral idea. What occurs then is not the universe to the prismatic art form of the spiritual person, but that the cosmos is an infinite differential form, as objectively real as themselves. And so person and cosmos resonate together. They really go together. They go together just like a symbolic idea and a ritual specificity. The identification between thought and body is viable. They can be aligned. But the relationship of the differential person to the cosmos is not one of alignment, but one of infinitely expandable arrays. So that one has a harmonic which is capable of something even farther differential from the critique of art forms. It's now available for the analytic of scientific forms. So scientific harmonic analysis now is not opposed to musical, critical appreciation, but is a deepening of it. And so one has a very interesting situation whenever science begins to come into play. And we will see in our education that science emerges as a form, not out of nature. It doesn't emerge out of the process of experience. Although they're important, it doesn't emerge from them, nor does it emerge from visionary consciousness. But science forms emerge from the historical process, from history. One of the ways in which authoritarian social forms and doctrines protect themselves from this is always to objectify history as the chronology, the king lists, the war dates, the president list. And by identifying history with chronological lists, one reduces it down to a ritual form, a ritual comportment that now also obviates the art of the personal, the spiritual capacities. And so one has not only the antagonistic antithetical of the artist and the authoritarian society, but when the artist is capable also of science, one has a protagonist in the antagonism who is always going to win. If you ally the resonances of art with the resonances of science, when the arts and sciences get together, they are always going to win because they are together not only natural, they are conscious, infinitely. And so the separation of art from science is one of the ploys that authoritarian social forms take to make sure that this doesn't happen, that this cannot happen. Shakespeare and Shelley, in each of their own ages, were the best voices for the freedom of the artistic person and the development of the scientific harmonic that is cosmic. When Sir Philip Sidney died in 1585, at age 31, he had become the most poignant poetic spokesman in England since Chaucer. He had refined himself, and his very large work was called the Arcadia, and he wrote two versions of it. One is the old Arcadia and the other is the new. And he was attempting to show that the artistic spread of man's consciousness in nature and in experience was a gorgeous tapestry of possibility and not at all some kind of limited plan. And in the midst of that, his best friend, who was one of the great English writers of all time, his name is Spenser, Sir Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queene. Spenser and Sidney were friends together, and in the beginning of the 1580s, right after Christmas 1579, Spenser dedicated a very special little book called The Shepherd's Calendar, because the calendar is the beginning of the ritual base upon which the transform out of chronology to the gorgeousness of the conscious ceremonial seasons. And the difference between rituals and ceremonies is that a ceremony has the conscious dimension always sparkling in among the pragmatic acts. It isn't just that you're doing the steps right, but you're doing them gracefully. You're dancing. You cannot walk through a dance. You have to dance the dance. And so it is the ceremonial quality of adding the music to the sound, of adding the singing to the voice, of adding the dance to the steps, so that you begin to get then, every time it occurs in human history, every time it occurs across the planet, you get a different quality of men and women all of a sudden in one generation. And they are as different from the previous generation as if it were literally they were black and white and you are now rainbowed. They were always sticklers for keeping everything exactly distinct. You're ready to have new ratios and discover. We live in a time in the early 21st century where we are again at that kind of a interface. The previous generation was a generation at the apex of planned, integral, exact ritualness. And this new generation is a generation discovering that their computer doesn't have just 16 colors, it has millions of colors. You can have colors that one could never have imagined, and yet you can deliver this. And so we are again in this kind of struggle. This learning is on the side of Shakespeare, on the side of Shelley, on the side of Aeschylus. And as time goes by more and more, it isn't that the weight shifts to that foot, but it's that the dance will become apparent. The scintillation of the ceremony of people free not just to be themselves, but to be whoever it is that they would like to be today. and be different tomorrow, and doesn't obviate them at all. One of the classic ways of describing the difference is the response given to Moses by the burning bush. When the burning bush says, "You go tell Pharaoh, let my people go and deliver them out of Egypt to a promised land." The old way of translating the phrase is when Moses says, "Who has sent me? What shall I tell? What shall I say?" And the old way was, "Tell them, I am that I am." That's an integral form. But it can also be translated with an italic dynamic, "I will be who I will be." Not that I am that I am is an identification. I will be who I will be is a prismatic transform. And so one has a difference right away, and it comes, oddly enough, into one of the clearest focuses of all time in the way in which, at an apex of Jewish culture about 1,000 years BC, that it came to an apex that was startlingly clear for the very first time, and has ever since then been one of these qualities of the earmark by which people can very clearly make the distinction between the two things. The occurrence of it initially was that the old Jewish tradition was always based on the Torah and on Moses as the author of the Torah as the first in a line of prophets. And so the Torah and the prophets make that first layer of Jewish tradition. But there is a transform that's brought into play when David becomes king, because he is not a prophet. He is not in the Torah and in the prophetic line. He is a singer of songs who can dance before the Lord with all his might. And so he has a royal poetic quality that is distinctly differential from the old rules, the Ten Commandments, the Torah. So that instead of having prophetic prophecies that fit in with the rules of the ritual behavior, David is singing about how sometimes it's a suffering experience to be personally open, but sometimes it is a joyful experience. And while the Psalms of David are extraordinary, his son Solomon raised the differential of the art of David's Psalms to the gorgeousness of the Song of Solomon. And the Song of Solomon is about a celebration not of one's personal differential suffering and joy, but of how two persons come together, and together in their love, their mutual exchange between the two of them, you now have a tuning fork that raises the personal art into a cosmic harmonic. And so love between two human beings who are personally differentially free all of a sudden illuminates the entire cosmos. That's a sacred marriage and is celebrated ceremonially because the entire cosmos, not the universe, the entire cosmos sings with them at their wedding, dances with them at their wedding. And one then gets the wedding of a freed earth with the energies of heaven. And it's not about the ritual steps of an ascension. It's about wingedness, flying free, anywhere, and of re-achieving then the infinite openness of the cosmos together. These traditions were put into the Song of Songs by Solomon about 1000 BC. And one can trace back and see that Solomon looked back 1,000 years from his time back to 2000 BC, and that they have an Egyptian origin. Because the whole thing about having a kingship was never in the Jewish tradition at all. It was all about patriarchs, not about kings. So the Davidic line of psalm making goes back to New Kingdom Egypt of 2000 BC. And when one looks at New Kingdom Egypt, where the great Egyptian love poems occur, they occur at a time where the most powerful differential art form of the day was the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And so love poems go with a death epic that is not about death, but about cosmic resurrection. If you have made it through to the personal freedom of personhood, then there is no death. So it isn't so much the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Its title translates really as the Book of the Coming Forth by Day. When the sun rises, you rise with it every day into eternity. There is no death. And so it is the risen from death to celebrate the cosmic love that's the foundation of the Psalms of David and the Song of Songs of Solomon. 1,000 years after Solomon, one finds again, reoccurring, a whole Solomonic literature, and one of the greatest focuses of it is called the Odes of Solomon. I think the Odes of Solomon were written about 40 AD by Mary Magdalene. It's a cycle of 42 odes that celebrate the transform of one's person in love to the cosmic harmonic. We're going to take a little break and we'll come back. Let's come back to the way in which spirit and poetry are harmonically available, because poetry has a different way that language works from the integral. The mythic telling of language rolls by images that have feeling tones, so that the language will move on the imagery and will follow the feeling flow. And this is a process, the process of myth. It is the way in which experience is carried this way. In the mind, the images are integrated into form by the imagination. And the feelings are integrated because they are deepened by meaning into thought. So that literally thinking is an elaboration of feeling. So if you ask somebody what they think about something, you might also just ask them how you feel about it. They'll tell you what they think. It's a very interesting thing. The old Einstein said, time and space are not conditions within which we exist. They are modes of thought by which we think. And the person speaking with him said, well, I don't think so. And Einstein said, precisely. The symbolic integral of language allows it to be written in symbols, in letters and characters. And so that the structure of a written language now delivered orally is not mythic, but what we call rhetorical, rhetoric. It has a symbolic structure that has deepened the mythic, so that the imagery now must not just flow and occur, but it must be structured by the imagination as its content, but that the structure of the structuring are ideas, so that ideas and the imagination form feeling and images from experience into a thought. But a poetic is a conscious transform of a rhetoric. Something that is rhetorical will always have a planned structure that follows closely the alignment to the pragmatic stuff of the world, the stuff that's there, and the way in which it generates experience and images and feelings and in language. And a rhetoric will always be the integral of that, the structure. But the structure of a poet is different from the good argument of the rhetoric. And so love and art and poetry and the spirit and persons are all in the same harmonic set. They're all resonances. They're all notes in the same song. So that classically, whenever men and women have matured to the point of being spiritual artists with their individual poetic capacities of a language, the test of it, the hallmark of it, was, could you compose a spontaneous spiritual song, a spontaneous creative hymn to express not your feelings and not to structure your thought, but to personally prism the expandable range of possibilities. And so one of the tests of this in ancient times, and the test was perfected by, in the Jewish tradition, by David and Solomon, father and son, was, could you make a spontaneous psalm, and could you then link those psalms, those hymns together so that they form like a necklace? And the Song of Songs is a necklace of spontaneous hymns from different moments brought together as an art form. Each ode, each hymn, each song is the personal prism of an actual moment artistically, but all of them together now make not an idea, but they make a linked poem structure, much like linked haiku then become not just haiku individually, but they link together and they allow one to have indefinite links of chains of haiku, and now one has the possibility of weaving into the linked haiku the prose, which is also now in a poetic. It's been transformed out of its rhetoric so that one has poem and prose together. It's called in Japanese haiban. And this is true in every major civilization on the planet, that art forms were made to that extent, to that largeness. And it was the necklace of poems. The poem was the personal art form, but the necklace of poems was the cosmic resonance of that, in keeping with its style. Here is an ancient Egyptian love poem from 2000 BC, just a part of it. I will lie down inside, I will be ill falsely. My neighbors will come in to behold me, and the sister will come with them. She will make the doctors unnecessary, because she knows my sickness. 1,000 years later, this is from the Song of Songs of Solomon. At night in bed, I sought my love. I sought him, but could not find him. I called, but no answer came back. I must rise and search the town through. I must search every street, every square. I sought him, but could not find him. While I searched, the watchmen found me. As they made their round of the town, I cried, "Have you seen my darling?" But not long after I left them, at last I discovered my love. I clung and would not release him till we reached the home of my mother, the room of her that conceived me. I charge you, maids of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and deer of the field, do not wake, do not quicken passion before it is ready to stir. Here's the 13th Ode of Solomon, written 1,000 years after that, written about 40 AD, and I believe by Mary Magdalene. Behold, the Lord is our mirror. Open your eyes and see them in him, and learn the manner of your face. Then declare praises to his spirit, and wipe the paint from your face, and love his holiness and put it on. Then you will be unblemished at all times with him. Hallelujah. This quality of poetic one finds again in the genius of Sir Philip Sidney, and then the magnificent cosmic genius of Shakespeare, and again in Shelley. And one finds in Shelley, like the famous Ode to the West Wind, this kind of a quality. It was written in the months following his wife's first publishing Frankenstein in 1818. He finished this, he started it just as she was writing Frankenstein, and he finished it just after Frankenstein was published. Just a few stanzas. Ode to the West Wind is 5 classical sonnets put together in a star necklace. This is just the first lines of the first of the 5 sonnets in that star. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou who chariotest to their dark winter bed the winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in the air, with living hues and odors, plain and hill, wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, O hear. This poetic quality in Shelley's time was the way in which language, especially the English language, was raised to a revolutionary transform. The reason for making a language this energized was so it would transform the dead plans of authorities into the living poetic of people ready to be free. And the same thing happened in Shakespeare's time. Exactly when Shakespeare was mature enough to take himself to London for the first time, to the big city. He was from Stratford, Avon, and it was a very large town. It had nothing to compare with London, was one of the great cities of the world already. He went there at a time when the crisis between the power of the English fleet was run against the power of the Spanish fleet, and they met in the Battle of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Shakespeare first went to London in the mid-1580s. And as he was there, he kept trying to find a way. He was only 20, 21, 22 years old, trying to find a way to open up his experience of the theater, which had dazzled him from the age of 5. Traveling players had come to Stratford. His father was the Lord Mayor of Stratford, and so he got introduced to these traveling players from a young age. And he wanted very much to be a part of the dramatic scene in London, which for the first time had the first public-private owned theaters in the world. Until Elizabethan times, theater was always a court procedure, a royal prerogative, or it was a civic procedure. In classical Athens, if you were a freed man, you were necessarily forced to go to Greek tragedies and Greek comedies. You were fined if you did not go. There were figures, there were social police that cordoned off the diameter of a street, and they would literally walk and scoop people to go to the theater of Dionysius. It was a civic duty. You must go there because it was essential. It was the medicinal forced transform of consciousness that had become essentially unnecessary in classical Athens in the 5th century BC. They knew that they were in a new terrain. It was a terrain where the first time it was necessary to master not only dramatic forms like tragedy and comedy, but also the qualities of 2 other forms that go with them, history and philosophy. It's no accident that Plato's philosophy is in dialogue form. It's no accident that Thucydides makes the first really technical history in the world. And there is a 5th element that's there because the closest friend to Aeschylus, when he was a young man and growing up in Athens, his closest friend was the greatest lyrical poet of the age. His name was Pindar. In Pindar's odes, while they are ostensibly about individual episodes at certain festivals, at the place in Olympus where Zeus was celebrated, or in Nemea where some of the games were celebrated. His poems are about sports events with a spiritual, poetic turn. And they're some of the greatest lyric poems of all time, but they're almost impossible to translate out of the classical Greek because he elides and ratios, time tenses, and descriptive qualities that usually are ordered in a rhetorical way so that they make sense. He recuts them so that they are like shards, like I'm doing in my presentation to you. I take this presentation out of the rhetorical mold and I throw it like confetti into the air, and with my spirit, I blow complex shapes that are scintillating so that when you finally do get how to see them, you will get how to see yourself in that way. Then you'll really have a poetic freedom, a personal capacity. You will never again be fodder for someone's box, ever again. It isn't like taking the handles off. It's like erasing the dimensions of the box forever. Then you'll be like the west wind. When your time to be wildly life-giving You will do so. When it's time to have a fallow period, you won't consider it death. And you will have an expanded quality where you're not limited to your experience and your thoughts about them, but you're as free as your consciousness to prism your own personal history. And out of that will come, what did one yogi call it? He said, the art of living and the science of being. Yeah, the founder of TM phrased it that way. In Shakespeare's day, the 1580s, was punctuated by the defeat of the Spanish Armada in such a peculiar way. It wasn't just that the English sailors were better. It's that the weather cooperated with the English. The waves, the winds themselves scattered the Spanish fleet, which was one of the largest fleets ever assembled. Spain didn't want to just win, they wanted to crush the English. We will crush them. We will kill them all. We will sink all their ships. We'll imprison all the women and children. How dare they challenge Spanish power? We're the conquistadores. The weather defeated the Spanish Armada. Blew the ships so far off course that some of them ended up on the Irish coast shipwrecked. That's a big storm. To be blown from the mouth of the Thames all the way to Dublin. So Shakespeare's last play, The Tempest, is about a storm that is going to blow away the old empire of authority and to release a new energy in the world, a new way of doing things. And the reason why he could sense this was not just his greatness and the power of the English drama. One of the glories of human history is Elizabethan drama. He learned from some of the best. Christopher Marlowe, who died, he was not even 30 years old. He died because he was assassinated, because he was not only a brilliant graduate from Cambridge University, he had an MA when an MA was like a super PhD. You almost never met anyone who could get an MA in the 1580s in England. And he was the most brilliant figure of his day. And so he was put onto a special service. He became a secret agent. A secret agent for the power structure of the nascent British Empire coming up. Only Christopher Marlowe crossed over a line. He wrote a great play about what happens when a personality tries to make themselves larger than life and oversteps and overreaches. And the play was called Tamburlaine. Tamburlaine is like a Genghis Khan, a universal conqueror, and how it leads to a very great tragedy that is inherent in the situation. And he followed it up by writing a second play that showed it's not only inherent in the situation, it's inherent in the personality of someone who is raised on authority and who tries to get around it by cheating. And the second play was called Dr. Faustus. Faust, who makes a pact with the devil that for 24 years he can have whatever he wants in the world, and for that he'll sign over his soul. And when Dr. Faustus came out, was being written about, it was being realized that Marlowe was puncturing holes in the balloon. He was showing you that the situation is loaded for tragedy and that the personality that is inculcated by that situation is loaded for tragedy as well. The only way to get around this, obviously, is we have to recalibrate the person out of their forced individuality and recalibrate the society out of its forced authoritarianism. And just as that was happening, the biggest revolution of the time was happening, and that was the taking of the Bible out of the hands of the church and putting it into the hands of individual human beings. Almost no one could read Greek well enough to read New Testament Greek. Almost no one could read Hebrew. Almost no one could even read some of the Latin translations that have been changed again and again by different power groups throughout history, so that it was evident, and a series of volumes were written in Europe, in Switzerland, in Geneva, and they were called the centuries. And each year, one of these centuries would come out, one of these tomes, volumes, of all the critical comments about how corrupted the church had become throughout the ages, as evidenced by the increasing corruption of the Bible. And so it became apparent by the late 1570s, by the early 1580s, that there was a struggle going on here between the church and the original Bible before it was tampered with. And so the King James Version of the Bible began to be thought about in this time period, that we need to go back to the original Bible before the church was corrupted, before the Bible was corrupted, and deliver that in the living language of the people so that they can inform themselves and each other with what the real roots of all of it were before it was messed with. And the first project came because of Sir Philip Sidney's brilliance with poetry. He chose to translate the Psalms of David. And in 1580, he finished translating enough of the Psalms so that one could see the necklace of the Psalms, which to his artistic person was the core of the Bible. It wasn't the Torah and the prophets, it was the Psalms of David, and from that, then the New Testament is like the cosmic resonance of the beautiful spiritual person that is released in the Psalms. This is Sir Philip Sidney's 1580 translation. This is 31 years before the King James Bible was released, before it was finished. Psalm 23. You'll recognize it, but you've never heard it in Sir Philip Sidney's beautiful Renaissance English. The Lord my shepherd is, and so can never I taste misery. He rests me in green pasture his, by water still and sweet, he guides my feet. He revives me, leads the way which righteousness doth take for his name's sake. Yea, though I should through valleys stray, of death's dark shade, I will no whit fear ill. For thou, dear Lord, thou me besettest. Thy rod and thy staff be to comfort me. Before me thou a table settest, even when foes' envious eye doth it espy. With oil thou anoint my head, and so my cup dost fill, that it doth spill. Thus shall all my days be fed. This mercy is so sure, it shall endure, and long, yea long, abide I shall, there where the Lord of all doth hold his hall. So, Sir Philip Sidney's Psalms become the core of a personal transform of the Bible. Out of authoritarian church hands into the personal, artistic, spiritual hands of a new people. By the time that Queen Elizabeth was dying, and they knew that she was going to be gone after all those decades, and they would have a new king, King James I of Scotland, would become James IV of England, one of the few really literate kings of that whole period. He knew how to read well. He knew how to write well. He had quirks. He had meannesses. He had his own agents. But he had a deep appreciation that he was given the mission to deliver the Bible in English to a population of people. And so he set up what was set up originally in ancient Alexandria. In Alexandria in the time of Ptolemy II, the second Ptolemy was the son of Ptolemy Soter, of the founder of Alexandria, who built it on Alexander the Great's plan. He's the one that built the great library in Alexandria. And he's the one who decided that the library should have the wisdom of all peoples, and especially of an adjunct wisdom tradition that was always just outside of Egypt and occasionally was in Egypt, and that was the Torah and the prophets and the wisdom books of the Old Testament. And so had 72 translators sent from Israel to Alexandria to work many years on making a translation of the Old Testament into Greek. It still exists. It's called the Septuagint. The Septuagint means the 70. There were actually 72 translators. So King James set up 6 commissions, 6 groups of scholars in pairs. He had 2 groups at Cambridge University, he had 2 groups at Oxford University, and he had 2 groups at the Center of Power in London at Westminster Abbey. And they were to make translations. Each group work on these translations and then exchange with each other and then compare their translations over years and years until they refined and came out with one glorious set of the Bible in the best Renaissance English. The leader of the first Westminster group is a famous theologian named Lancelot Andrews, who was the favorite mentor reading for T.S. Eliot. After he read enough to write The Wasteland, he became an Anglican devotee, and Lancelot Andrews was like his literary theological hero. They took the best Protestant translations of the Bible, the Geneva Bible, the Reims, France Bible, a thing called the Bishop's Bible that came out in the late 1560s, and they constantly tuned it and revised it and opened it up until the language of the King James Bible literally sings. And when it was published in 1611, it was published with the promise that this would be a new freedom for men and women for there on out. And that's when Shakespeare produced The Tempest for the first time. It was produced the morning after Halloween, November 1st, All Saints' Day, 1611, in front of the king, who had just produced the King James Version, and the king's court. And The Tempest is Shakespeare's taking of the energy of this kind of personal taking back of the origins of vision away from all authoritarian structures and putting it back into a magical transform of the magical person. Unbelievably, King James and his court did not realize that it included them as well, that Shakespeare's Tempest is iodine on all authoritarian structures, including the court of King James, including the origins of the British Empire. And so, many, many times, you will find Shakespeare throughout the ages done up in current modes and not delivered real, not delivered whole, because the real Shakespeare is so powerful that he will dissolve all of the false accumulation of artificiality. There's a great study of Shakespeare called Artificial Persons, that when drama is an art form and has its ability to generate real historical conscious energy as a process, so that one now could reach cosmic vibrations from it, then the characters on the stage are more real than the artificial people who are parading around and limiting themselves to the authority structures in the society. It is they who are the puppets. It is they who are the artificial people. The people on stage in this drama are art prisms, and they are more real than them. In this way, art is superior to the rhetorical life of minions. Shakespeare is a hero on that level. It's the level of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, who in their day did the same thing. In fact, when we dealt with the myth section, we took the last great Greek tragedy, Euripides' Bacchae, because Euripides' Bacchae does what Shakespeare's Tempest did. It shows, not in a mirror, but in a jewel of artistic presentation, that all of these authoritarian forms are based on ritual and on limited doctrinaire thinking and on confined experience, and have nothing natural about them. That when you bring nature into play, and especially a nature that now has a conscious transform in it, those rituals are seen as shallow. That experience is seen as bogus. And the mind that has prided itself on thought is shown to be a duped monster. A kind of, in fact, a realization, discovery that one has become an artificial monster like Frankenstein. This is from Frankenstein. Originally was in 3 volumes. This is the center. This is the beginning of volume 2. This is Frankenstein in the original 1818 version by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein says, "Nothing is more painful to the human mind than after the feelings that have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows and deprives the soul both of hope and fear." And he goes on from there saying, "I was made to be a Superman. And what I realize is that I only have death where there should be the empty openness. And I only have a monstrous desire to kill even myself rather than live in the unity of life. I am a monstrous-sized artificiality, not a superhuman, but a subhuman." And that the true horror of Frankenstein is not that he's ugly, but that he knows that he is permanently dead, made to be artificial, under the aegis of thinking that that's super. The qualities that we're pursuing here are qualities of how vision in many times on the planet are now all needing to be brought together in one, not one jewel, and not just one necklace, but into that treasure trove that the planet has many necklaces, many jewels. And before we can go out and inhabit the whole star system personally free and look to other star systems, we must not just master this, but we must radiate with it and be able to spontaneously sing our own songs to add to this great treasure. That's what this is about. It takes a while, because it takes a while. More next week.